Hello. Relaxing today. Maybe. Relaxing actually means doing whatever I want. And I might just as well want to do Tartarus. So.
Cosmic Skeptic podcast. My name is Alex O'Connor, and I'm joined today by Dr. William Lane Craig, who is professor of philosophy at both Houston and Biola universities, with 2 PhDs, has famously debated God and the existence of God with an expansive array of very high-profile atheists, and always seeming to come out of those interactions unscathed. He's also the author of more books than years I've been alive. So, Dr. Craig, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here on the podcast.
Certainly, Alex. Good to be with you. That number of books in your age may be a reflection of your youth, I think.
Maybe. I think how prolific you are is kind of the point that I was trying to get at there.
Maybe.
Sure.
So, as I said just before we got started, Dr. Craig, I'm sure that most of my audience will be familiar with you and some of the things you've said, but they'll be familiar with them through the lens of the atheist, because in my community, a lot of people have responded to your works. And so the people who are listening might feel as though they've heard everything you've had to say before, but it's unlikely that they've really given the time to listen from the horse's mouth, except in a debate scenario where they're probably going in with some biased kind of starting points. So today I wanted to discuss the Kalam cosmological argument, and one of the principal reasons for that is because not too long ago I put out an article on my website about why I thought there was a particular version or justification for the Kalam cosmological argument that begs the question. And I got a wealth of response from it. And I also saw that you'd made a series of objections that you called something like objections so bad I couldn't have made them up. And that was one of them. And I thought, whoa, maybe I'm misunderstanding something here. So I thought it would be good to sit down and talk to the man himself. So just as a bit of introduction, why is it that you're so well connected to the Kalam cosmological argument? Are you the person who gave it that name? I know you're incredibly well known for having popularized it. So what's that connection?
I did my doctoral work in philosophy at the University of Birmingham in England. And I did it on the cosmological argument for God's existence. And in studying the history of this argument, I discovered that although the argument goes all the way back to the 4th century after Christ, in medieval Islamic theology, this argument became highly developed and highly sophisticated. And so I tagged the argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, in honor of that medieval Muslim tradition. Kalam is simply the Arabic word for a point of doctrine and denotes medieval Islamic theology.
Excellent. And so the form of the argument is quite impressively simple, and I'm sure that most people listening will have at least heard it in passing.
Portals?
Would it be a fair analysis to say something of the following? The first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence.
Where?
The second premise is that the universe began to exist, and the conclusion which logically follows is that the universe had a cause.
Yes.
And this is a deductive argument, which means that if both the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. So the only way to attack this argument, the only way to raise objections, is raising objections with the premises.
Right.
I find that most people, when they try to raise objections, they jump to the second premise, something like the universe beginning to exist. It's quite a difficult thing to prove, it seems, and yet you've got quite an expansive literature on different reasons why we can know this to be the case. So perhaps we can start there before talking about the first premise. How can we know, let's say philosophically, because I know there are scientific ways and philosophical ways to look at this. Philosophically speaking, how can we make that assertion that the universe began to exist?
I do think that the second premise is the most controversial premise in the argument, and therefore the one to which I've devoted the most attention. Historically, the second premise that the universe began to exist was supported by philosophical arguments. It wasn't until the 20th century that there was any sort of empirical evidence for the beginning of the universe. And as I looked at the various arguments that were offered historically for the beginning of the universe, the finitude of the past, it seemed to me that 2 of them stood out. One would be the argument based on the impossibility of an actually infinite number of things in reality. And then the other would be the impossibility of forming an actually infinite collection of things by successive addition. These arguments are independent of each other. Even if one fails, the other could still be sound. And so together, I think they provide very persuasive philosophical grounds for affirming the finitude of the past and hence the beginning of the universe.
Sure. So let's think about this. The difference between an actual and a potential infinite, which is the crucial distinction to make,
Yes.
as far as I understand it, is that an actual infinite is kind of what it says on the tin. It's an actually existing infinite number of things, as it were, that actually exist in reality, whereas a potential infinite is something that can tend towards infinity, such as dividing the space between 2 points on a ruler. You can divide that infinitely, but that doesn't mean that there are actually an infinite number of things between each point. Is that a fair analysis?
That's exactly right, Alex. And the concept of the potential infinite dominated Western mathematics and philosophy until the 19th century, when Georg Cantor, a German mathematician, discovered the concept of the actual infinite. So the notion of a potential infinite plays its role in calculus, where we think of infinity as a limit which a process approaches but never arrives at, whereas the notion of the actual infinite finds its application in infinite set theory, where mathematicians talk about sets that have an actually infinite number of members in them. And it is absolutely crucial to distinguish these, because one is not denying that the potential infinite can exist. The denial is that there can be an actual infinite in the real world.
Sure. So there are two objections that, to me,
Let's
can be
try
derived from this idea of the distinction
Freud,
between
maybe.
the potential and actual infinite. And the first is this. There's an argument to be made that potential infinites in some way assume the existence of actual infinites. For example, people think that if a potential infinite is something like two spaces, the space between two objects being infinitely divisible, that there are somehow an infinite number of divisions between those 2 points. And so although when you do the
So
divisions
what
it
is
tends
this?
towards infinity,
LRD.
the number of actual divisions, the number of halfway points or something like that, is an actually infinite number of things. So that would imply that actual infinites do exist in between any two spaces. What's the problem with that?
The problem with that is that it is guilty of a modal operator shift. It is true that possibly a line is divided here and here and here and here ad infinitum, but it doesn't follow that there is a place here and here and here and here where the line is possibly divided. That's two different claims. And I would say that a line is not a composition of points, that the line is logically prior to any points that you specify on it. And that therefore the possibility of potentially infinite processes does not imply an actually infinite number of points. To assume that a line is a composition of points is to already beg the question in favor of the existence of an actually infinite number of things.
Sure. So to flesh this out, let's think of a more concrete example. I'm thinking of the example of this paradox of the light bulb, which you've probably come across. This is how I'm kind of understanding the objection in its most strong form. You can imagine some kind of light bulb that is programmed to switch on and off at particular intervals. And it's programmed such that you have a length of time, let's say 10 minutes, that once half the remaining time has elapsed, the switch gets hit, right? So it starts off, and halfway between the kind of time elapsing, the light bulb gets turned on, and then halfway between the remaining time it gets turned off, and halfway between the remaining time then it gets turned off. And obviously the on and off switch is increasing in speed in terms of how quickly it's going on and off. Now, the reason that this is an interesting point to raise is that by the time the actual time has elapsed, it seems that you actually have a substantiation, a thing that has actually happened an infinite number of times. And we have to answer the question of whether the light bulb would be on and off at the end of the question, but the kind of real question, the real interesting part is relevant to this discussion, is that if you have such a programmed light bulb, it would seem not just that you've kind of got a potentially infinitely divisible space, but that an actual infinite number of things has happened in a finite amount of time.
Yes, this is a paradox known as Thomson's lamp, after the author who invented it. And the question that Thomson was raising is, at the end of the process, will the light be on or off? And there's no answer to that question because there is no causally prior state immediately prior to the final state of the lamp after it's gone through the process. And so my argument would be that Thomson's lamp is absurd, that it cannot exist because there will be a causal gap between the states of the lamp in the series of switchings and the state of the lamp after the switchings are complete. There is no immediate causally connected state prior to that last state. And therefore, the state of the lamp at that last state would be literally uncaused, which I think is metaphysically absurd.
Sure, so from this are we supposed to take that the lamp couldn't be programmed in such a way? I mean, it seems like it doesn't break any kind of, on the surface I mean, any kind of logical or metaphysical rule to say that you could have such a program, but you seem to be implying that because of the conclusion it leads to, we should kind of go back and then judge that actually that couldn't be programmed in such a way.
Well, I would say that metaphysically it is impossible because of what I just said about this causal caesura, so to speak, between the states of the lamp in the switching series and the state of the lamp after the switching series is ended. But it's also scientifically impossible as well. Nobody has thought there could really be such a thing because once you get down to certain quantum distances, it's impossible to switch the lamp on and off anymore. The thing is purely a thought experiment. It's not meant to be something that's physically realizable. And so this wouldn't have any impact upon contemporary science. Contemporary science has no use whatsoever for the actual infinite. Contemporary science operates purely on the basis of potential infinities.
Sure, and perhaps it raises the question of whether or not there is such a thing as a minimal interval of time, which I know is an open question.
Yes.
We should press the reason this is important to the argument, to the kalam, is that essentially we're trying to address the idea that the universe could have been eternal, because this is one of the atheist escape routes many of the time, is to just say, well, look, yes, maybe there needs to be some kind of explanation for the causes that caused everything, but what if that just goes back eternally and the universe is eternal? And what you're trying to demonstrate here is that the universe can't be eternal because it leads to logical absurdities.
Oh, not logical, Alex. I would say metaphysical. There's no logical contradiction in the notion of the actual infinite. Infinite set theory is a well-understood branch of mathematics. It's perfectly consistent and coherent. But I maintain that when you try to instantiate it in the world of the real, that then it leads to these absurdities. And the Thomson lamp illustration is an example of that second argument that I mentioned for the finitude of the past, the impossibility of forming an actually infinite collection by successive addition, like switchings on and off of a lamp.
Sure, so this is why we can talk about the concept of infinity in mathematical literature, but that shouldn't give us reason to think that it can be substantiated in such a way that would affect the argument, right?
Yes, that's right. In mathematics, there are just all sorts of entities. For example, imaginary numbers and infinite dimensional spaces and so forth that cannot be physically instantiated, but they're perfectly consistent logically.
Okay, so the second objection that this raises and why it's important is that you can ask the question, if an actually infinite number of things or number of events or something like that is impossible to be real in the sense that we're using the term real, does God not count as an actual infinite?
Now, it's important to understand here, Alex, that this is not an objection to either premise. It would just show that the theist is going to have a problem too, but it doesn't do anything to refute the argument. Now, theists have typically, well, not typically, universally held that God is not composed of parts.
Yeah.
God is not an aggregate of definite and discrete elements that make up a collection, and
Where's
therefore
my wave pulse?
the notion of God's infinity is not a mathematical notion. It's not a quantitative notion. It's a qualitative notion. It means things like God is perfectly holy, omniscient, omnipotent, timeless, spaceless, and so forth. All of those sort of qualitative attributes go to make up God's infinity, but the infinity of God is not a quantitative concept.
Sure. The reason why I would have immediate trouble with this is thinking about, although the attributes of God that you mention are qualitatively infinite, there may be some room for applying quantitative infinites. For instance, if God is not dormant, right? If God is not just a kind of impersonal being that sits there doing nothing, we have an image of God that does things, that intervenes, that creates universes at particular times but not at others. It would imply that perhaps you could ascribe to God something like an infinite series of events in terms of an infinite number of actions that he's caused, unless there's some point beyond which God is dormant. I don't see why you can't apply the same reasoning to say that if God commits actions, then God has committed an actually infinite set of actions.
What you're raising here, Alex, is the very interesting question of God's relationship to time.
Yeah.
And as you explained so well, if there is a series of successive events in God's life, then the same arguments against the infinitude of the past would apply to God that apply to the universe. And therefore, the classic proponents of this argument, like Al-Ghazali, argue that there is a beginning of time, and that God existing beyond the universe, not before it, not before time, but beyond time, is timeless and unchanging and perfect, and that therefore the arguments are inapplicable to God because God doesn't have a past.
So, anticipating this reply, I was thinking about the concept of the afterlife and how the reason why it's not problematic to say that the afterlife is infinite is because that seems to be a potential infinite, right? Because it starts at a certain point and tends towards infinity, but there isn't already an existing kind of infinite set of days or something in heaven in the afterlife. The problem I see is reconciling that with what you just said, which is that God exists not kind of infinitely for an infinite amount of time, but outside of time itself. My understanding of the afterlife is somehow being with God, right? And so if the afterlife is being with God in an infinite kind of way, doesn't that mean that the afterlife is a kind of actual infinite? Or is a kind of, rather than a potential infinite?
I think what it implies, Alex, rather, is that God is in time. The view that I defend is a rather novel hybrid view, but I think it's the best view, and that is that when God creates time, he enters into time in virtue of his real causal relationship with temporal changing things, and in virtue of his knowledge of tensed facts like what time it is now. So on the view I defend, God is timeless, sans creation, but in time, from creation going forward on into the afterlife.
Sure, and it's important that you say sans creation rather than before creation, because that doesn't make much sense. It's like talking about before the Big Bang or something like that. Who was it that said that that's like asking what's north of the North Pole, right? It's a contradictory notion. But does that imply that in order to accept all of the assumptions that you're making, or the arguments that you're making, I should say,
Anyways,
that
alright.
although the afterlife is a kind of being with God, it's not being with God in his kind of timeless state. You are still confined to time in the afterlife in some way. So there's still, how would we understand it? Is there still like a part of God that's outside of the afterlife?
No, I don't think so. I think God enters into time. He takes on a temporal mode of existence at the creation of the world. So that when God creates the first moment of time, he enters into time and thereafter has the temporal mode of existence. So I think God exists right now I think that in the incarnation, God entered into human history in the person of Christ, and that in the afterlife we will enjoy what the Bible calls everlasting life with God and with His Son, Jesus Christ.
Which implies potential infinity, because everlasting is a kind of ongoing process. So
that's right.
Does that mean that when we say God is timeless, as I've heard you say a number of times, we kind of mean that he was timeless, a part of him is timeless, but now is a temporal being, something like that?
Well, here, it's so easy to be tricked by language.
Right.
And I think what we have to say is that God is timeless sans creation and in time subsequent to creation. And that is a non-contradictory way of stating it.
Is that non-contradictory? Because the way I'm thinking of it is God sans creation is timeless. And so God kind of exists eternally as a timeless being, but somehow at the same in the same breath exists as a temporal being as well. So it's temporal and non-temporal.
There is no time. Sans creation, this is a timeless, spaceless existence, and time and space come into being at the moment of creation, which I would identify for the sake of simplicity with the Big Bang, with t equals 0, the first moment of time.
Sure. So when we talk about, so it doesn't make sense to talk about God creating the universe at a point in time, right?
Say again?
It doesn't make sense to talk about God creating the universe at a point in time.
Well, let me modify what I said. I shared with you my understanding, what I think is the best view. But there are certainly other theist philosophers who hold different views of God and time.
Oh my gosh.
For example, Richard Swinburne, Alan Paget, John Lucas hold to a view of God existing literally prior to creation, but in a sort of non-metric time. That is to say, a time in which you cannot distinguish successive intervals of duration, so that there is no point 1,000,000 years prior to the moment of creation. There is no point 1 hour before creation. There is this kind of amorphous time that is pre-creation time, but it's not metric. It doesn't have a metric to it that enables you to distinguish intervals of varying duration. So there is that view out there. That's not my own view, but I want to say there are a number of options open to theists. It's not as though the Kalam argument commits you to a certain view of God and time. Other theists wouldn't maintain that God is timeless, just simplicity, that God never enters into time. I disagree with them, but there are theists who would hold to that, and that would be consistent with the Kalam argument as well.
Sure. The reason I think this is important is because I know it's not strictly the conclusion of the Kalam, or maybe you think it is, but I've heard you talk in the past about how once we identify that there's a cause to the universe, we can say that it's a personal cause, let's say, because of the fact, and I may be misunderstanding here, but my interpretation was that it has to kind of do something to create a universe, right? And if an infinite being creates a finite thing, that doesn't seem to make sense unless the infinite being can change its nature in some sense. But how can we understand this outside of the idea of time, right? Because when I first heard that kind of line of thought, I was thinking, well, are we saying there's an infinitely existing being who, because at some point in time creates the universe, something must change, and therefore it must be a kind of conscious decision-making cause? Without time, I don't see how that jump can be made.
I wouldn't express it exactly the way you did, but I think that you're in the ballpark. The problem here is, how do you get a cause with a begin? How do you get an effect with a beginning from a cause which is permanent?
Yes.
If the cause is truly sufficient for its effect, then if the cause is there permanently, the effect ought to be there permanently. How in the world do you have a permanent cause but in fact it only begins to exist a finite time ago. And
Oh my
it
God,
seems
it's
to me
fast.
that the best answer to that question is that the cause is a personal agent endowed with free will, because free will can initiate new effects without antecedent determining conditions. And so what I would say is that this timelessly existing free agent freely wills to create the universe, and therefore time comes into being at that moment, and this being enters into time at that moment.
So this is the problem I'm having, is you say he wills the universe into being at that moment. But how can you make sense of a term like at that moment if this being is timeless? Because as you say,
Right.
if it's an infinite being, the question is, if that cause is sufficient and infinite, then the effect should also be infinite, implying that there was no sufficiency up to a certain point. But how can you talk about points with no time?
This is a great question, and the question here you're raising is, which one is explanatorily prior? God's decision to create the world is simultaneous with the origin of the world. They're at the same moment, the first moment of time. So which is explanatorily prior? Is it the moment of time? And it is at that moment that God chooses? Or is it rather that God makes a free choice, and therefore that is the first moment of time? And I would say it's the latter. God's free choice is explanatorily prior to the existence of the first moment of time, because in the absence of some sort of an event, there would be no time. It would just be timelessness. You need something to happen in order for time to exist. And what happens is that God freely chooses to create the universe. So it's all about explanatory priority here.
So the insufficiency of the cause before, let's say, if it's the wrong language, but before the universe exists, the insufficiency of the cause, which means that it hasn't existed yet, is prior in explanation rather than prior in time.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that what you call the insufficiency of the cause is due to the fact that the free will of this being has not chosen to create the universe. This being has not made such a decision. But the instant that such a decision is made, time comes into being. Indeed, the decision is explanatorily prior to the first instant of time.
Yeah. When you say the free, it's because of the freedom of the being, and the free being hasn't made the decision. It feels like that it's begging for the word yet to be on the end of that. It hasn't made the decision yet.
I know.
You know? But it's like we're carefully avoiding that language because of the complications of time, but it seems like the explanation that you're giving, it feels to me like naturally it invokes a sense of time. I still don't quite see how it works without time.
Well, you just have to be very careful if you're going to be philosophically precise to use tenseless verbs in your sentences and not use temporal particles like before or yet and things of that sort. And I think that we can avoid those and make coherent statements. For example, I said sans the universe, God exists timelessly. That's a tenseless verb. Sans the universe, God does not freely choose to create the universe. So I think that these statements can be correctly made if we just watch our tenses and our adverbs.
Sure. So I should say to the listeners, I'm going to leave resources and writings that Dr. Craig has made on these points, because there's no way you can get to the bottom of them in a podcast like this. But the reason that I wanted to kind of talk about this for a little bit was because of the fact that one of the objections that has been made, and I think I've made it in the past, is this idea that, yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument gets you a cause of the universe, right? But it doesn't get you something resembling a god. But here what we're doing is we're trying to show that in order, if we kind of admit that there is a cause of the universe that's outside of the universe, and therefore timeless, eternal, infinite, whatever it may be, that it does in fact have to be personal. It does in fact have to have free will and some form of consciousness. and so the kalam actually does imply a type of cause, not just a cause. I think that does that make sense?
Well, it does to me. This is Al-Ghazali's argument for the personhood of the cause of the universe. This isn't original with me. It's in Al-Ghazali's work. And when I first read it, I thought, this is absolutely brilliant. This is the only way that you can get a temporal effect with a beginning from a permanent cause. It's if you've got an agent endowed with freedom of the will who can choose to do something without antecedent determining conditions. And since that time, Alex, I've enunciated two other arguments for the personhood of the creator. One from Richard Swinburne, based upon the distinction between personal explanations and scientific explanations. And then another based upon the causal power of the cause of the universe. An unembodied mind is the best candidate for a timeless, spaceless, immaterial cause of the universe. So I've got three arguments, all leading to the same conclusion, that the cause of the universe is a personal, unembodied mind, which is very close to a theistic concept.
Sure. So what we've kind of covered then, and those points, again, I'll leave resources down below for people to explore. I don't want to spend too much time on the same point, the same direction. What we've shown here is that there's a philosophical reason, at least, to think that the universe began to exist. That's the second premise. And there's philosophical reason to think that if the conclusion does hold, that the cause is a personal cause, that's probably best described as God. So I want to discuss the first premise, because a lot of the time in the literature, as far as I can see, people think that this is the kind of obvious one. It's the kind of, well, come on, of course everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, that's not to say there isn't argumentation behind it, but it seems like people are just far more willing to accept it as intuitively true. Have you found the same thing?
Well, actually, Alex, that's what I think. When I first enunciated the Kalam cosmological argument, to me the first premise is a no-brainer. I thought anybody who is intellectually honest will agree to the first premise. And so I have been amazed, frankly, at the number of non-theists who are willing to admit that the universe began to exist. I think they're impressed with the scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe, and therefore bite the bullet and say the universe came into being uncaused from nothing. And to me, that is just a compromise of one's intellectual integrity, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I mean, to be clear, if a person accepts the second premise, that the universe began to exist, and that includes, a lot of people will want to say, well, the Big Bang wasn't the beginning of everything, but whatever was before the Big Bang would just be part of the universe as we're talking about it. If we accept that premise, then the listener needs to bear in mind that the only way to deny the conclusion is to, as you say, bite the bullet and say that something at least that begins to exist doesn't have a cause. So,
and this fact drove a lot of the resistance to Big Bang cosmology during the 20th century. People like Fred Hoyle, the proponent of the steady state model, was very explicit that it is metaphysically absurd what the Big Bang theory says, that the universe came into being without a cause at some point in the past. He said, this is impossible. There's got to be something before it. And so he adopted or propounded his steady state theory. And we've had oscillating theories, vacuum fluctuation theories, all sorts of alternatives to try to avoid that beginning, because I think quite rightly these theorists see that if the universe truly began to exist, it would be a metaphysical absurdity to say it just came into existence uncaused.
An interesting piece of trivia, Fred Hoyle is of course the man who coined the Big Bang theory, but he did so pejoratively. He was on a radio show and he said, what is this Big Bang theory? He was making fun of it, and that's where we get the name from. But let's talk about this. So on your website, Reasonable Faith, because I do my research, I found you gave 3 justifications for this first premise, reminding the listeners the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, the 3 justifications you give, with a bit of explanation, but just the first line is firstly that something cannot come from nothing. Secondly, that if something can come from nothing, then it is inexplicable why just anything and everything doesn't come into existence from nothing, or come into being from nothing. And third point is, and I quote, common experience and scientific evidence confirm the truth of premise 1. What kind of common experience are you talking about when you say that?
Everyday experience, scientific experience. We always look for causes of events. That's the whole project of science. And we never come across things coming into being uncaused. Now, immediately people will think about quantum indeterminacy, that there seem to be events that on at least the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics are uncaused. But 2 things here need to be said. The argument is very carefully worded. It does not say every event has a cause. It says everything that begins to exist has a cause. So the argument is quite consistent with quantum indeterminacy and there being uncaused events. What it says is that there can't be things, substances, that come into being without a cause. And then the second thing that I would say is that the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum indeterminacy is by no means the only or the most plausible interpretation of quantum mechanics. There are at least 10 different physical interpretations of the equations of quantum mechanics, and some of these are as fully deterministic as non-quantum theory, so that it's not a proven counterexample in any case.
Yes, which is something, again, listeners should bear in mind. I do hear a lot of people want to reference quantum physics, which is famously not very well understood. So we've got to be careful when we try to do that kind of thing. But I
have a friend who says that the quantum mechanics is sort of the trump card that a lot of people like to play. They don't understand it, but they just say, well, if quantum mechanics can be like that, then any absurdity can happen.
Yeah.
It just shows really a lack of understanding of the theory.
Now, it's not to say that there aren't very well thought out arguments related to quantum physics in relation to the discussion we're having, but you are right that a lot of the time you do hear it from people who are, as you say, using it as a trump card. I've experienced that myself, but there was an inconsistency that I found, which I was struggling with, or an apparent inconsistency when I was reading your points on the Kalam. And it's on this point, right? Because on the one hand, you say if things can come into existence without a cause, then why wouldn't it be happening all the time, right? Why wouldn't a horse or an Eskimo village, as you say, just pop into existence out of nothing, right? Why don't we observe that? Now, holding that in mind, in Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology, you are talking about this quantum idea that quantum mechanics gives us evidence of something coming from nothing, essentially. And your response to that is to say this. You say, popularizers touting such theories as getting something from nothing, that is quantum mechanics, apparently do not understand that the vacuum is not nothing, but a sea of fluctuating energy endowed with a rich structure and subject to physical law. Such models do not, therefore, involve a true origination ex nihilo. Okay? So, help me out here. You say that quantum mechanics isn't an example of something coming from nothing because it doesn't come from nothing. But then you say, well, if something could come from nothing, why wouldn't a horse pop into being? Well, my thought is that if we did observe a horse popping into being in my living room, that similarly wouldn't be out of nothing, right? Because my living room isn't nothing.
Oh, all right. Now, here we're talking about whether there's an efficient cause for that. Remember, Aristotle distinguished between several different kinds of causes: efficient, material, formal, and so forth. And when I talk about whatever begins to exist has a cause,
without portals, but my fucking
of efficient causes.
biceps.
There needs to be something that brings it into being.
I'm in pain.
I don't think it has to have
Oh,
a
shit.
material cause, but there does need to be at least an efficient cause
Holy
that brings it into
fuck.
being. Now, with respect
I
to
love this song
quantum
so much.
mechanics, the
This
point
offset.
there is that certain popularizers of modern
Thinking
science,
Space
like
is so
Lawrence
good.
Krauss, love to say
Absolutely love
that
that
in
level.
quantum mechanics you have theories by which the universe comes into being
I
out of
always
nothing.
thought that Tidal Wave fucking sucked, but Thinking Space 2 is incredible. Just the song, the Grey Deco. Thinking Space 2 is much nicer than Amethyst.
And in fact, that's just not the case. You have a physical state of affairs, which is
That's
either a
dry.
quantum vacuum, a field of fluctuating energy, or these are quantum physical fields described by physical laws. And these physical states of affairs can reconfigure themselves so as to produce particles or the universe. And so there definitely are causes in this case for the universe or the particles coming into being.
Yeah, Lawrence Krauss, his book, The Universe from Nothing, is a fantastic
No,
overview
nothing
of
is not bad.
cosmological science, but I hear this a lot of the time too. People say, well, you know, you talk about something coming from nothing, but nothing isn't really nothing. And if that's the case, then we're not talking about the same thing here.
No.
I agree with you on that point.
Have you read the review in the New York Review of Books of Krauss's book, The Universe from Nothing?
I'm sure I did.
David Albert, the philosopher of quantum physics, David Albert, wrote a review of Krauss's book, and it just is excoriating for the sloppiness of Krauss's use of the term nothing.
I have read that review. I think I read it in preparation to talk to Lawrence Krauss, who I know follows me on Twitter, so I'll be careful what I say about him here and how much I agree with you on the sloppiness of his work. But yeah, it's worth bearing in mind that we're talking about two different things here. Right? When the philosophers are talking about nothing, they mean, as Aristotle said, what rock stream is. They mean nothing, right? And so if there's some kind of quantum soup or something, then that is not actually nothing. But
yeah, here's how I like to put it, Alex. Nothing, the word nothing, even though it's a pronoun, it's not a referring term.
Right.
It's not a singular term. It's a universal quantifier. It's a negative quantifier. It means not anything.
Yes.
So if I say I had nothing for lunch, that is saying I did not have anything for lunch.
Because if you don't make that careful distinction and you think of nothing as something that can be spoken about, you can make arguments like in A.C. Graylin's History of Philosophy, he put forward the argument, nothing is brighter than the sun, a candle is brighter than nothing, therefore a candle is brighter than the sun, right? But clearly, the point being raised here is that when we talk about nothing, we have to be clear that, as you say, we're talking about a kind of existential qualifier. We're saying no thing, not the existence of
Universal quantifier. Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah, which shows again the importance of philosophy of language in dealing with even scientific issues.
Yeah, but on that point of equivocating terms where perhaps they shouldn't be, I'm intrigued because a lot of the time people will say, now I'm not sure if this is an argument you would make, but this is what my article was on, my essay was on about the begging the question of the Kalam. Now, some people have said, now when you refer to common experience, I thought you might have meant something like, anytime we see something beginning to exist, it appears to have a cause. That's a common experience that a lot of people will refer to. They say, look, you can never have something that begins to exist, me beginning to exist, a chair beginning to exist that doesn't have a cause. Because the important point here for me was that the kind of beginning to exist we need to talk about in order for the Kalam to hold, in order to get our conclusion, is beginning to exist from nothing, surely. Whereas a chair doesn't begin to exist from nothing. A chair begins to exist from pre-existing material. And yes, although it makes sense to say the chair exists now and didn't exist an hour ago, what we really mean is that the material that the chair is made out of has rearranged itself, or been rearranged in such a way that we now arbitrarily give it the label of a chair, but nothing has actually begun to exist.
Oh, Alex, I think that's just well, as you say, that's included in my list of arguments so bad I couldn't.
Indeed.
Just think of your own self. You began to exist.
What if
It is absurd to think that you existed before your father's sperm and mother's egg united.
He did.
In
Actually,
conception
the atoms.
for you to begin to exist. You didn't exist during the Jurassic period. You didn't exist during the era of galaxy formation. You began to exist about 18 years ago in this conception event. And so don't think that beginning to
What's my
exist
CPS?
is something that is subverted by its having a material cause. I explicate what it means to begin to exist by saying X begins to exist at T if X exists at T, and T is the first time at which X exists.
Yeah.
And that is fulfilled for the chair and yourself and other things that begin to exist. And the point is that when we look at the things that begin to exist, we have a tremendous inductive argument that everything that begins to exist, so defined, has a cause. It's hard to think of an inductive generalization that could be more strongly supported than that.
This is where we have to be careful about language to make sure the point gets across. As glad as I am that it's me to say that I wasn't around to witness my parents' conception, I think that when we say it's kind of absurd, yes, that I existed in the Jurassic period or something, what I'm being careful to say here is that everything that I'm made of existed at that time.
Right. Sure.
And so when we talk about beginning to exist in the sense of the common experience in order to justify premise 1, we're talking about beginning to exist conceptually, beginning to exist as an arrangement, something like this. But we're not talking about actual matter becoming instantiated or something like that.
Well, I don't think that it's necessarily just a matter of arrangement. I mean, take fundamental particles, for example, like electrons or quarks. They're not arrangements of anything because they are fundamental particles. You're raising an issue here as to whether or not there are composite objects, things that are arrangements of simples that are themselves not arrangements of anything. And there are certainly these sorts of fundamental particles. But more to the point, Alex, would be that the definition I gave of begins to exist, namely X begins to exist at T, if X exists at T, and T is the first time at which X exists, it's irrelevant whether or not X is a fundamental thing that is not an arrangement of prior materials or whether it is. Either one of those fulfills that definition.
Perhaps I can explain why I'm having trouble with this as pertains to something like a chair, which is that it seems to me that designating when that point T is an arbitrary measure that we make subjectively, right? If you have a collection of wood, and you kind of begin forming it into a chair, you could say, well, look, it's not a chair right now. Maybe if I bend this little bit like this and hammering that, and now it's a chair. It seems like to say this is the point T at which the chair now exists is an arbitrary subjective notion that we've kind of placed upon an object. It's not actually intrinsic to the object itself.
Well, I do think that that's a good point. I would say an even better example would be a building, like a skyscraper. When does that actually begin to exist? But there are plenty of things that aren't like that, like yourself. I think it's very clear when you began to exist, and even with respect to the chair or the building,
no, it's not clear.
We don't need to specify time T as an instant. Time T can be any interval of time. It could be 1970, for example. This building began to exist in 1970. If the building existed in 1970, and 1970 was the first time at which it existed. So don't think that the time at which something begins to exist needs to be too finely specified, because as you say, there will be some vagueness as to when it actually begins.
But at the same time,
with regard to the universe, though, this is all academic because there is a very precise time at which the universe begins to exist.
Well, I'm trying to move towards a distinction between the universe beginning to exist and things like chairs beginning to exist, and in order to show why perhaps they don't support each other. Let's say you have a skyscraper and you don't know particularly what time it begins to exist. But you could say that it's a period of time instead. Still, it seems that the notion of beginning to exist, as we're talking about it as pertains to chairs and skyscrapers, is not an attribute of the thing, but an attribute of us. It's an attribute of the people observing it and giving it a label. The fact that a piece of wood becomes a chair is not something so much true of the wood, but as it is true of us, because nothing about the actual material really changes in such a way that's meaningful, except as we decide that it's meaningful.
Boy, I think that's a kind of anti-realist view of reality that I would have grave reservations about. That the chair is some kind of a mental construct that you make. That certainly wouldn't apply in any case to fundamental particles or things that we don't think about. I mean, for example, there was a time at which Tyrannosaurus Rex began to exist.
21st
And if you go back far enough, there were no Tyrannosaurus Rex prior to that. And this has nothing to do with my conceiving of it, or...
Well, I mean, so this is actually quite a helpful example, talking about species. So take the species of Homo sapiens, right? It seems to me clearly that although it makes sense to say that, there was a point at which human beings existed, and a point, say, 50,000 years before that where human beings didn't exist.
Right.
But clearly the coming into existence of this species Homo sapiens, it is something that we have put upon it.
Okay, now granted, when I said Tyrannosaurus Rex, I was thinking of a dinosaur, a flesh and blood organism. I wasn't thinking of a species.
Okay.
And similarly with Homo sapiens, I agree with you. It isn't clear at all what is to be classed as Homo sapiens. They're all kind of hominids that it's very difficult to classify.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, if you go back in time far enough, for example, 1 million BC, there weren't any human beings around at that point. Human beings began to exist sometime later, and that's an objective fact that has nothing to do with our conception.
Allow me to try putting the same statement you just made in different words. You said human beings began to exist. What if I said something like, because we both agreed a moment ago that the matter that makes up human beings already existed, even if the human beings didn't. What if I said something like, the matter which exists arranged itself in such a way that we would label Homo sapiens, right? That seems to me the same thing as saying that the Homo sapiens began to exist.
Well, if we would label it correctly, but that there is an objective fact here. It doesn't begin to exist in virtue of our labeling it. The reason we label it as a Homo sapiens or as a human being is because you have an organism that is recognizably human. It's not reptilian, it's not amphibian. This is a hominin that is endowed with certain kinds of mental and behavioral capacities that we would count as human. And the beginning of existence of that thing is explored by paleontologists and paleoanthropologists just wholly independently of us.
I think I've hit on our disagreement then, which seems to be that you would say that we call a Homo sapien a new object that begins to exist, a new thing, because it begins to exist. Whereas I would say that conceptually it begins to exist because we've decided to call it a Homo sapiens. It's kind of the reverse, right? I think that's the disagreement we're having.
Yeah, well, this gets into this question again that I mentioned, whether or not you think there are really composite objects or not. And however you come down on that, there are going to be certain entities that are not composite objects, like fundamental particles, like electrons and quarks and so forth, and I would say persons, like yourself. And these provide clear-cut examples of things that exist that are not just arrangements of prior matter. and therefore don't have any objective reality.
Well, okay, so the reason why I wanted to make this argument is to try and get across the point that I feel that the only thing that, if anything, has meaningfully begun to exist, the only thing that would fulfill that criterion would be the universe itself, because everything within the universe that begins to exist in a conceptual sense only, is the argument that I was trying to make, but clearly you disagree with that.
Yes, right.
I suppose...
And I think, I mean, you're talking here about a view that is, and I hate to get technical, it's called mereological nihilism.
Yeah,
that is to
yes.
say that there are no composite objects.
Essentially, yes.
But even mereological nihilists recognize that there are fundamental particles that are not composites. They're not aggregates of things. And some, like Peter Van Inwagen, would say that living things, like horses and humans and persons, are also not just aggregates of material, because they are alive and therefore have a kind of unity to their being that goes beyond being merely an aggregate of material things. So I think the person who's going to take the line of mereological nihilism, well, it's worse than mereological nihilism. I mean, he has to say that there are no fundamental objects.
Well, I'm not sure that's the case. For instance, if we accept that fundamental particles exist, and what we mean by fundamental particles are simply things that can't be broken down any further. And so what we mean when we say beginning to exist is a rearrangement of fundamental particles in such a way that it kind of that it gives rise to arbitrary labeling as a new object, right? So that's the kind of view that I would take. Not that there aren't composite things, but that everything that begins to exist is just an arrangement of composite things.
All right, that's not you mean arrangement of fundamental things?
Yes. Well, if you break it down far enough, yes.
Right. Yes. Okay, and that would be a consistent view. It's a very radical view, one that I wouldn't hold. I can't see any good reason to be a mereological nihilist. But in any case, I don't think that would subvert the argument for the universe beginning to exist.
Right.
Because in that case, you can rephrase the argument not such that the universe began to exist, but you can say all fundamental particles began to exist.
Sure, but then do you see how that just completely undermines the idea of the common sense experience of things beginning to exist? Because although it may make philosophical sense to talk about fundamental particles beginning to exist, we wouldn't be able to say something like we've observed it happening.
Oh, no, I think that's not right, Alex. What it requires is a modification of the second premise, not the first. The first premise, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, would remain intact.
So long.
It's just that on the mereological nihilist view, very, very few things begin to exist because they don't exist. There are no people. There are no horses. There are no skyscrapers. There are no chairs. Well, but if you reformulate the second premise so that it states not the universe began to exist, but all the fundamental particles began to exist, you get the same conclusion.
Okay, so perhaps I can explain why, because you say it's at least a consistent worldview. Let me try and explain why I thought this would beg the question when it came to the Kalam, was because if we accept the view that everything that begins to exist as we observe it in the world, let's say, is not actually beginning to exist in the meaningful sense, it's just a rearrangement of pre-existing matter. And ultimately, the furthest you can break it down is to fundamental particles, but those existed since the beginning of the universe. Meaning that, in other words, in the meaningful sense, the only thing that began to exist was the universe, right? Now the reason this is a problem is because to beg the question is to accept the first premise only by virtue of already having granted the conclusion. Now, if the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause, but the only thing that truly begins to exist in the sense we want to talk about is the universe, then the first premise just becomes the universe has a cause, which is identical to the conclusion.
No, it just means that the universe would be the only instance of that first premise. That I want your listeners to understand how radical the view is that you're expressing here. It's not just that things don't begin to exist. It's rather that these things don't exist at all. There are no such things as chairs and planets and people and skyscrapers. None of these things actually exist, and that's why they don't begin to exist.
William Lane Craig's channel. Why is his profile picture? Oh no. Alright. Exposing the truth of Christianity. Yeah, sure.
The only thing that begins to exist would be these fundamental particles. And so this is I mean, you can take that line if you want, but it's really a radical view, because I know that I exist. I think Descartes is quite right about that. If there's one thing I can't doubt, it's that I exist. And I began to exist. So I think this is not, you know, this is sort of like an academic way to try to escape the argument, but it's not a plausible solution. The person who really is looking for truth.
The two observations I'd make is potentially first to say that on the Cartesian view, yes, you can know you exist, but I'm not sure you could therefore know that you began to exist, but just on the Cartesian view.
Fair enough.
But and secondly, and kind of important here is that you say that by denying that things begin to exist, I deny that things exist. I would rather frame it as saying something like the limits of an object, and for people who are listening, what I mean by that are the boundaries of the thing that make it that thing as opposed to something else, right? The definitional boundary that you put around that thing is not a property of the thing, but a property of us in a way, right? So it does exist conceptually. So I can make sense of saying, here is a book. But what I'm saying is that my calling this a book and my saying that this has boundaries such that this is a book and this other thing over here is not that book is a product of my mind, right? But it's like it does conceptually exist. However, the actual boundary itself is an arbitrary.
It's a mind dependent reality. That's why I said this is a sort of anti-realism that I find extremely implausible. You're saying that you construct reality by imagining these boundaries, but these are not mind-independent realities. If there were no people, there would be no books and planets and galaxies and stars.
Yeah, it's a strange line of thought. I would say that calling it something like anti-realism might be misleading because of the fact that I wouldn't say that nothing exists independent of the mind, right? I'm not saying that things existing or rather, you know, existence is a product of the mind. What I'm saying is that categorizing that which exists into independent objects is a product of the mind, right?
Right, except for fundamental particles,
which themselves began at the beginning of the universe. Now,
those would be the only mind-independent realities on this mereological nihilist view, that you just conceptually set boundaries to things and so construct the world of objects around us.
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned is how radical the view is that I hold, because I think you're probably right in the implications, and I hadn't considered them to the fullest extent before, that if I'm going to say something like things only begin to exist as a rearrangement of pre-existing matter, and the beginning to exist is an arbitrary metric we put on it, that the only thing that exists definitionally as an independent object, mind independently, are fundamental particles, and everything else that exists as kind of individually discernible objects are mind dependent, which is a really interesting radical implication of my view that I'll give some thought, and for my listeners I'll try and write an explication on that view.
So if you do take that view, the sort of teleological nihilism, then you're right. We wouldn't have any inductive examples of things that begin to exist.
Right.
The first premise would still be true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, but we wouldn't have any examples of things that begin to exist other than these fundamental particles. We still got all of those to deal with, and that's fine, but you wouldn't be able, as you say, appeal to your common experience on this view.
Yeah, so this is
why... that's a fair point.
And this is why I thought it begs the question, was because, and I guess the implications are more radical now that I think about it, but the reasoning I was thinking of was, well, if the only thing that ever really began to exist was the universe, then, as you say, that the first premise, although it doesn't become the conclusion, it means that the only thing which begins to exist is the universe. So when we say everything that begins to exist has a cause, the only example we can think of is the universe. And so by saying the first premise, you're essentially believing that because you believe the universe has a cause.
Oh, no, now there I think that's a mistake, Alex.
Okay.
I have actually reformulated the Kalam cosmological argument to make it more modest by rephrasing the first premise in the following way. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Second premise, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. So that statement of the argument would be fully in line with mereological nihilism. If the universe began to exist, then the universe has a cause. Or if the fundamental particles began to exist, then they have a cause, etc., etc. So it would just mean that it's not begging the question. It would just mean that you couldn't use the sort of inductive argument that I appealed to.
Quite right. As you point out in your series about objections and about the objection of circularity in particular, you say,
Oh my God.
well, arguments don't beg the question, people beg the question, right?
Yeah.
And so I would agree with you that if you reformulate the Kalam, or even if you keep it in the original form but use a different justification, you're not begging the question. My essay was just trying to make the point that if you justify it in that
CPS?
inductive manner, it seems to me that you're begging the question.
Well, I'll agree with you that the inductive argument wouldn't work if you have this kind of mereological nihilism. And then I would fall back on the two metaphysical arguments, which for me are the most important as opposed to the inductive argument.
So the kind of other justification that you might give, and the one that I found really interesting, was saying if things can come into existence out of nothing, that is, if you deny the first premise, then why doesn't it happen all the time, right? Why don't things begin to exist out of nothing all the time? Now, my first thought was to say, how do we know that they don't, right? Because to come into being out of nothing would surely imply coming into existence not within the universe, because everything in the universe is not nothing, as you've said. And so to come into being out of nothing, it would have to somehow come into being outside of the universe, and therefore we wouldn't observe it. So maybe it is happening all the time, but we wouldn't be able to observe it by definition.
Yeah. Here I think you're making the same mistake that we talked about earlier when you spoke of the horse coming into being in the living room.
Yeah.
Thinking that therefore it's not out of nothing. And what I explained there was that I'm saying without an efficient cause. That's what I mean by out of nothing. So if things could come into being without an efficient cause, it seems inexplicable why things aren't just popping into existence all around us, things of different sorts, because they don't need efficient causes to bring them into being. This was an argument that A.N. Pryor developed, and I found it just completely convincing.
So let me how can I put this? A horse. How about an argument like this? Now, I've heard what I think might be this kind of line of argumentation from you before, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So, if someone were to say something like, and it seems absurd on the surface, but if they said something like, well, what if it's the case that universes are the only thing which can come into being out of nothing, right? A horse can't come into being out of nothing, but there's something about the universe, and we already know that the universe is a special kind of something compared to everything within the universe. It seems to kind of have we need to think about it in a different way.
Yeah.
Could we not say something like, well, maybe things do come into being all the time, except the only thing that come into being out of nothing is a universe, and therefore we wouldn't be able to observe it?
As A.N. Pryor said, prior to its existence, the universe doesn't exist so as to constrain what can come into being or not. So you can't say that only things of a certain kind can come into being without efficient causes, because without their causes, there just isn't anything to constrain it. So I don't think that you can say that only certain kinds of things can come into being without efficient causes.
Yeah, now the argument that I didn't want to put it in your mouth was one that I've heard elsewhere, of people would say the argument that the reason you can't say that only universes can come into being out of nothing is because nothing doesn't have any properties, and so therefore can't have a kind of preference for universes over other things.
Yeah.
My response to that was to say, what if the necessity of it being a universe is not a property of the nothing, but a property of the thing? And let me explain myself. For example, if we human beings create a circle, it has to be round, right? We can't create a square circle.
Right.
But that's not due to a property of us. That's due to a property of the circle, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way, although nothing has no properties and so
Holy
can't prefer
fuck.
universes, what if it can only... What if only universes can come from nothing because of the property of the universe, not because of the property of nothing?
Right. That is exactly what you would have to say, because as you say, properties only inhere in existing things. Beings have properties, not non-being. So you'd have to say it's an inherent property of the universe that it can spring
So
into
bad.
existence without a cause. And I just don't make sense of that.
Which sounds absurd.
Something that doesn't exist come into existence without a cause because it has a property after it comes into existence.
Yeah,
I mean,
it sounds strange, but the reason why I think it's useful to think in those terms, or at least of the possibility of it happening, is because specifically the objection that why don't things pop into existence all the time? I suppose what I'm trying to do is make at least a far-fetched case. I'm trying to show at least a possibility that things could come into existence out of nothing, and yet by definition we'd be incapable of witnessing it. So maybe things do come into existence out of nothing all the time, but because these are only universes, we'll never be able to observe it, we'll never be able to see it.
let me commend you for your method, Alex, because by pushing these questions, what you help the atheist to see is the intellectual price tag
Yes.
of his atheism. And
I love this guy, actually, really.
I think that's very valuable. One of the goals of the Christian apologist will be to try to raise the intellectual price tag of non-belief. And if non-belief or non-theism requires me to be a mereological nihilist, to think that things have an intrinsic property, that they can come into being, that other things don't have. This is all raising the intellectual price tag of non-belief. For me, at least, Alex, just way, way beyond what I'm willing to pay. And so that's helpful that you're doing this.
That is a really, really interesting way of thinking about apologetics and the argument that we're having. Is kind of like, what's the better deal here, right? Because both worldviews seem at least consistent, but you've got to ask yourself, how much you're willing to sacrifice of your intuitions, how much you're willing to sacrifice of the beliefs that you think are true in order to hold to those conclusions. And the key point is taking the justifications that we're giving and showing what they lead to, right? Because a lot of people consider, well, this argument may allow this to be the case, but they don't think that if you accept that justification, it can also lead over here, and you don't want that, right? And so I think this discussion has demonstrated that every time you think of a justification for the point you're trying to raise, you have to consider the implications of that justification and the other areas of philosophy it causes you to sacrifice. That's a really, really fascinating way of thinking about it. And I think it's a great place to end this conversation.
Thank you so much for having me on today. This has been an unexpectedly rich and thought-provoking conversation, and I really enjoyed it.
That's really wonderful to hear, because I remember kind of wanting to have you on, and I didn't tell anybody this would be released without my followers knowing before it happened. But if I did tell them, they'd probably be saying, go and debate him, go and show him what's what, and it's like, I would never dream of trying to do that with someone of your caliber, so I just wanted to kind of ask questions. So I'm glad to hear that it's kind of led to this kind of conversation, especially it's gone in directions I didn't think it was going. But it has been fascinating, and I think that it's definitely going to lead to some follow-up points that I want to make. So anybody listening to this, there's a good chance I'll do some kind of video or some kind of essay on some of the points that we've covered, because there's so many things flowing out of so many implications flowing out of what we've spoken about. But as I say, listeners, just I hope that you found this to be useful. I hope that it's good to listen to a conversation about something like Kalam that isn't in a debate format, because it may be the case that you've never done so before, and I hope this is of use. Do leave comments if you have any kind of reactions to the stuff we've been talking about. It's always good to keep the conversation going. I want to remind you that everything that I do on this channel is supported by you on patreon.com/Cosmic Skeptic. So if you like this kind of conversation, please do consider becoming a supporter. But Dr. Craig, thank you again for coming on. It's been a real pleasure to have you
My
here.
pleasure.
Okay,
Oh,
so
he's
as
still
always,
here.
I've been Alex O'Connor with the
Cool.
Cosmic Skeptic podcast, and today I've been in conversation with Dr. William Lane
Cursed.
Craig.
Jordan Janai.
I think to be a cosmic skeptic, is a dreadful thing to be, just a horrible position. This commonsensical slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary ends, I think is demonstrably false. I talked to people in the old Soviet Union before
Really?
the fall of the Iron Curtain about how they managed to stay Christian despite the constant Marxist propaganda that was fed to them by their
It was weak.
professors.
My name is Alex O'Connor, and Within Reason is a weekly podcast bringing you long-form conversations with interesting guests every single Sunday. Since Within Reason is still a relatively new podcast, it would be a great help to me if you could find us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and subscribe and give us a rating. It really helps to push the podcast even further. And if you like the podcast, it would mean the world to me if you would consider supporting it financially by going to support.withinreasonpodcast.com. This will take you to my Patreon page, which will allow you to contribute monetarily towards the upkeep of this podcast, and really is one of the biggest ways to help this podcast and this YouTube channel to grow. Financial supporters of Within Reason will, wherever possible, receive early access to podcast episodes a few days before they go live to the rest of the world. I'm still very much trying to get this podcast off the ground. It's still very new to me. I still don't know if it's going to be successful. I don't know if I'll be able to keep it up. But I hope that I can, because I'm enjoying it so much. And supporting me on Patreon is one of the best ways you can in that process. I'm still doing almost all
Yeah,
of
it's
the work
real
myself,
successful,
editing the videos, for example,
Alex.
and the promo. And so if you like what I'm doing,
You're
then it would
doing
mean
a
a lot
great
to me if you
job.
would consider signing up. My guest today is Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig is a professor at Houston Baptist University and Biola University, and perhaps the world's most prominent Christian writer, apologist, and philosopher. Dr. Craig is famed for his prolific philosophical output, as well as his high-profile debates with famous atheists such as Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, which really brought him to prominence in the new atheist sphere as
Really?
a fierce
Sam
debater
Harris?
and someone that you should perhaps be a little bit scared to go up
I
against.
gotta
You
watch
don't
that.
think that you would have said, oh, I was having a hallucination.
I gotta watch his debate with Sam Harris.
I spoke to Dr. Craig a number of years ago in a previous podcast episode and have regularly cited it as perhaps my favourite podcast episode ever produced. And so I was delighted to sit down again with Dr. Craig, this time to talk in particular about Christianity. One important thing to note is that this episode was recorded back on the 13th of October 2022. So if you're wondering why it is that Dr. Craig brings up the death of Queen Elizabeth, it's because it was still quite recent at the time of the recording.
The same
In this
death,
episode, you can
really.
expect to hear us discuss the difference between the USA and the UK in its approach to the separation of church and state, why it is that upon dreaming that I was in a plane crash, I was motivated to start praying, and the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. And this episode of Within Reason is brought to you by Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a free email newsletter bringing you the latest in tech, finance and
Really?
business news straight to your inbox every single day,
Thank you so
Monday
much.
through Dr. William Lane Craig, thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast.
I'm delighted, Alex. Thanks for asking me.
It is a pleasure to have you back. I remember our last conversation, I think went quite well, was received quite well. But I also found, after the fact, information was given to me that apparently, because my name on YouTube is Cosmic Skeptic, upon first hearing about my invitation, you were a little bit hesitant to come on my show because of the name Cosmic Skeptic. Is that true?
Yes, I think to be a cosmic skeptic is a dreadful thing to be, just a horrible position. And I understand you've since changed your moniker, isn't that right?
Well, it's a little bit complicated because the podcast has a new name and I'm hosting it as Alex O'Connor. But the Cosmic Skeptic name is a little bit too sentimental for me to give up entirely. It's still my Twitter handle and the main attraction of the channel. But it's an unfortunate byproduct of not seriously thinking through the name that I gave my channel when I first set it up. Not realizing that one day I'd be inviting distinguished
they're so cute. I love them.
academics to consider sitting down with me. So I'm glad that you managed to see through that and sit down with me anyway, and to do it again.
Well, certainly. And before we begin, Alex, I just want to say how really deeply sorry we were to hear of the passing of Queen Elizabeth. Our condolences go out to all of you folks throughout Great Britain and the Commonwealth. She was a marvelous woman and lived a life of incredible service and dedication to her people, and will be greatly missed.
I wonder.
I'm quite happy to hear you say that, especially given that I made a video, which you may or may not know that I made a video very recently, being quite critical of the monarchy and the reaction to the Queen's death. So did you not see that?
No, I wasn't.
That's mere coincidence.
I did not see it, but I'm something of an Anglophile, having studied in Britain and having roots in Britain, and so we were really grieved to hear of her passing and watched the funeral, and were very moved and inspired by the service of the church, and well as the interment, and then also just of her very bold and frank Christian testimony that she bore. She was a remarkable monarch.
Yeah, the British monarchy is in a strange position of still being officially buttressed by a Christian faith, that is the faith of the Church of England in particular, which I find quite strange given that the majority of the United Kingdom have now thrown off that religion, unlike the United States. The UK is kind of the polar opposite in that it is technically a religious state, but in practice very secular, unlike the United States, which is technically secular, but in practice very religion-oriented. Do you...
Yes, I think one of the healthiest
to survive,
things for the Christian church in our country has been the separation of church and state, that we do not have a state church. And what that means is that the church, in order to survive, must do so on its own strength without being propped up by the government. And it seems like across Europe, wherever you have a state church, it has suffered seriously and is in a state of decline.
Almost.
Whereas this separation of church and state that we have in the United States has been very, very bracing for the religious vitality of our nation.
Well, yeah, one of the things that people don't realize is that the separation of church and state is as much supposed to serve the church as it is supposed to serve the state. The origin of Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation was in a letter wishing to protect the Danbury Baptists, I believe, from persecution by the government. And so it actually works the other way around to what a lot of people think it is. Now we hear talk of the separation of church and state as don't allow religion to meddle in government affairs, but it has its origins in an equal and opposite force, not allowing government to interfere in religious affairs too.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We've got in this country both what's called the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And this guarantees not only that religion doesn't interfere in the government, but that the government cannot infringe upon the free exercise of religion in this country. And that is a precious right, which is often under duress and needs to be defended, but is extremely important. I think you're quite right about that.
Yeah, but this is something that's been eroded potentially in more recent years, and by more recent years I mean the recent history of the United States since the 20th century. The printing of "In God We Trust" onto the currency seems a little bit strange for a secular a nation whose original motto was "E pluribus unum." Putting reference to God in the Pledge of Allegiance, things like this. I wonder, as a Christian yourself, who will doubtless celebrate the values that are being instilled into these institutions, are you nonetheless hesitant to see them officially embossed in this way in what should otherwise be a secular nation?
That's a very interesting question, because I must admit to feeling a degree of discomfort about those very things, because the way in which they're justified is that this kind of civil religion is so general and so innocuous that it becomes virtually meaningless, and therefore is not intended to establish religious faith. And to me, securing that kind of expression at the expense of meaninglessness and inconsequentialness is a high price to pay. So I do feel somewhat uncomfortable about that. I would rather have these phrases be imbued with deep, significant meaning and excluded than included at the price of triviality.
Yes, well, I see this problem happening all the time. I remember, for example, in my Catholic upbringing, being forced to recite the Our Father and the Hail Mary, goodness knows how many times per day, and it got to the point where it's as though the words didn't mean anything to me anymore, because I was reciting them as if a poem or something, rather than really reflecting on every single word. Do you think, actually, I mean, because the Our Father in particular, it comes from a gospel recording of Jesus when asked by his disciples, "How is it that I pray?" Jesus responds by saying, "Well, pray to our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." And these are where the words come from. Do you think that the Our Father is supposed to be recited in maybe a word for word, or at least statement for statement fashion, or do you think that was more an intention of generally how someone should approach prayer?
The latter. I think it was supposed to be a schema that you would follow in your praying. You would first honor God and his name, and then you would pray for your daily needs, and this wouldn't simply be provision of food, but for other needs, and then for the advent of God's kingdom. It seems to me this is sort of a general schema that we as Christians can follow in our prayers, but not to be something that is said by rote memorization.
Yes, I remember that one time, and psychoanalyze this as much as you like, but I had a dream that I was dying in a plane crash, and it kind of confirmed this no atheists in foxholes narrative, and that when I was in this plane crash in my dream, one of my first instincts was to say an Our Father, to think, look, just in case, let's see what we can do here. And one of the things that occurred, and it was in that strange situation where you're kind of in control but not in control of what you're doing in a dream. It wasn't a lucid dream, I started saying the Our Father, but I went out of my way to say it in original phrasing. I tried to change every single word or every single phrase.
Well, that's commendable.
And it was as if in that moment of where prayer, if it's going to be tried, and let's see if this really works and done properly, it was an exercise in trying to really actually get to grips with the words. And I think this is where a lot of religious instruction may go wrong, and what puts so many people off is this ritualistic approach to engagement with religion that you see across schools, when it should be about actually engaging with the subject.
Yes, and what you did in your dream was you made that your own by putting it in your own words instead of just ritualistic.
You can just as well talk to your tilby.
Recitation. You made it a genuine prayer in that sense. I think that's commendable.
Yeah, and that's the first time I've mentioned that story publicly, and I do wonder what the religious online will make of it, because they'll probably want to read into it a bit. I must say that I think it's a little bit weak and potentially self-defeating for people to say, aha, see, in your moments of despair, you turn to God. It's as if saying, look, I know that we can't convince you with
No
reason
way.
and argument and evidence, but I tell you what, when you're in your most desperate situation, then maybe you'll finally consider it. I don't know if that's as strong of an argument as it could be, just to preempt that.
I'm not sure I ever prayed to God like seriously when I was in despair. After all, it's because of God I got into a desperate situation, so you know, God is omniscient and omnipotent. That means he knows that I'm in a pinch, in trouble, so to speak. And yet, he never cares, so I pray.
Response from people, but I did find that interesting that was a
Yes.
that was a response, as if I was finally willing to take this Pascalian wager that I've been told so many times is actually a con.
Yes. And I wonder what would happen if it weren't simply a dream but a near-death experience. I was recently reading about some of the research done on these near-death experiences that people report, and there is sometimes a remarkable sense of approaching God or coming near to God that is consistent across these experiences.
Yes, I mean, of course, I would, being an atheist, favor an explanation of such experiences that says something like, well, if religion is, from a sociological, psychological perspective, something like an exercise in the denial of death, as terror management theory would have it, that human beings are trying to cope with their position in the universe by essentially inventing stories that aren't really true, that this is what we'd expect when people come face to face with death. They'll have a momentary, at least, need to more emphatically reaffirm this death-denying aspect of their culture and their faith, and so it would be no surprise even on an atheistic account that people would become more religious. In fact, this is what studies indicate, that when reminded of one's own death, a person becomes more religious, and that's even true if they're an atheist. They become more religious nonetheless, and there's a religious and an atheist interpretation of why that might be.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, but that's fascinating.
It's a fascinating area of study, terror management theory, that says that most of human endeavors are an exercise in trying to ignore or deal with our fear of death. There are lots of really interesting study cases if people are reminded of their own deaths. The most famous example was some judges in Arizona were asked to recommend a bond for a case of solicitation of prostitution, and those who were reminded of their own death gave an average bond of $455, and those who weren't reminded of their own death gave an average bond of $50. And the theory was that if most of human culture and human activity is an exercise in dealing with our fear of death, then when reminded of our death, even in a fairly subtle way, we become more in need of affirming the things which deny our death, which in this case would be taking part in something bigger than the individual, like the legal system for a judge. That would be their way of contributing to a culture that exists outside of them. And so religion is sometimes portrayed as the most obvious version of this, by literally promising immortality. It's a way to escape from death. That would be my atheistic interpretation of what happened in that dreamy plane. But who knows? Maybe it was God trying to, tickle me in the shadows or something. I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out one day.
I couldn't say.
I invited you today, Dr. Craig, to hopefully talk a little bit about the nature of Christianity in particular, given that last time we spoke we talked about the Kalam cosmological argument, which is a great point of philosophical interest. But at the end of the day, you're not just a theist, but a Christian. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you, actually, was in regards to this kind of thought that somebody maybe would be compelled to take this Pascalian wager at the moment of their death. And this is the kind of story that you often hear of somebody coming to faith in a moment of emotional necessity. What do you think is a more powerful approach to bringing people to the faith of Christianity? Is it things like trying to prove the historicity of the resurrection, or more trying to demonstrate what it is that the resurrection is supposed to represent for people emotionally?
No.
Oh, it's so short.
Well, I'm sure that if you're talking about evangelistic effectiveness, it would be the latter. because I do think that people tend to make decisions primarily on the basis of emotions rather than on the basis of reason. But having said that, I think that many university-educated people are closed to the message of the gospel because they think that it is intellectually uncredible and therefore not something that can be believed by an intelligent person. And so for that reason, I have tried to present the message of the gospel in the context of giving an intellectual defense of the faith. I doubt that very many people will become Christians because of the arguments, but I think that what the arguments can do is give a person the permission to believe when his heart is moved by the message of the gospel.
I see. So when talking to, say, an atheistic crowd, I've seen that in some of your lecture tours, I attended one in person actually when you came to Oxford just before the pandemic, I think, and you tend to use 5 arguments, I believe. I'm not sure if this is still your approach, but you'd lay out, I think it must have been the Kalam, the fine-tuning, and one of the arguments was the resurrection of Jesus. In those instances, when you're talking to university students who are oftentimes going to be predominantly atheists, maybe not in the actual lecture theatre, given the kind of talk that it is, but is your approach here something like, listen to these arguments, they should convince you or compel you at least to move slightly more towards Christianity? Or is it more a sense of, well, let me paint this as an intellectually credible position for you, but actually bringing you to Christianity is going to require something else entirely?
Yes, it's the latter. And so if you look at those arguments, Alex, that I present, they begin with great generality. God is the best explanation why anything at all exists, rather than nothing. And then it becomes a little bit more...
Maybe yes, but not Christian God. But an indifferent God.
Specific. God is the best explanation of the origin of the universe. And then still more specific, God is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life. And then the moral argument that God is the best explanation for objective moral duties and values in the world, which raises then, of course, the question of our moral culpability before God. And then I end, typically, with the claim that God can be personally known and experienced. And often I will, if I have time, share here a word of personal testimony from my own experience of coming to Christ. And so it moves from the intellectual to that more personal dimension, and it tends to end with a definite personal appeal to people to explore a commitment to Christ and to know him in a personal way. So it's not just an intellectual exercise.
I've heard you described as an evidentialist, and I wonder how much this label applies to you in how much weight you put upon the public evidence for Christianity as reason for your belief. There was a letter that Dostoevsky once wrote to a friend of his, and I can't remember who it was, but in writing this letter, he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it was just about, if I found that all of the facts lay outside of Christ, I'd sooner reject the facts and throw myself with Christ than reject Christ and throw myself in with the fact. This is something that Dostoevsky wrote, which I think goes unremarked upon in religious analyses of his works. What do you make of an approach like that? Is it something that you're sympathetic to, or do you think that if the evidence points in the other direction, that is what should trump any sort of emotional appeal?
Now, those are two different questions. I think that a person can be in a situation in which the evidence points in an opposite direction to what is true. We all know situations in which people are presented with misinformation, for example. So I talked to people in the old Soviet Union before the fall of the Iron Curtain about how they managed to stay Christian despite
they
the
were
constant
ignorant.
Marxist propaganda that was fed to them by their professors at the university. And for many of these students, they had no recourse intellectually other than simply their personal experience of Christ, which was so real that they would follow it in opposition to the arguments and evidence of their professors. And I think that that is quite legitimate. And for that reason, I'm not an evidentialist in a certain sense of that term, although I think there is adequate evidence to make it more probable
last
than not that
release is so
Christian
consistent.
theism is true. I don't think that that sort of evidence and argument is necessary in order for belief in Christ to be rational. I think that on the basis of the personal experience of God himself, that a person can be rational when believing in Christ. And that's that fifth point that I mentioned, that God can be immediately known and experienced. And I think for the person who truly knows God, this is a reality that is such that he will be willing to hold to it even in the face of evidence to the contrary, with the hope, of course, that he will find out that in fact that evidence against it was illusory or answerable, and hope to get answers to the objections. So there's a difference between what that is and what you said Dostoevsky believed, that if the facts really were against Christ, he would choose Christ rather than the facts. I think that's impossible, because if the facts are that Christ is not God, that he did not rise from the dead, it would be crazy to believe those things.
Indeed.
So we want our beliefs to be aligned with the truth, but in our historical situationness, sometimes people are in situations where they don't have adequate evidence to apprehend the truth. And there we can be thankful that God, through his Holy Spirit, has made an immediate knowledge of God accessible to them.
So would you say something like, let's
This
say,
is
sufficient
impossible. This
evidence,
is so boring.
and
You
by
need a
evidence
new
I mean
pattern every attempt.
things like
Or you
empirical
will
evidence,
die out of
analytical
boredom.
reasoning as opposed to personal experience, might not be sufficient reason to engender a belief in God, but could potentially be a good reason to disbelieve. Let's say if there were evidence strictly to the contrary, if the bones of Jesus were discovered, for instance, to give a famous example, this would be the kind of thing, or I should pose the question, would this be the kind of thing that would essentially just invalidate all of the religious experience that you may have had in your life, that you say sort of exists in a different evidential plane, but surely upon discovering the bones of Jesus, proving that he never rose from the dead and ascended into heaven, this would give you reason to essentially favour this evidence over the personal experience that you've had with God, such that that personal experience becomes invalidated?
If the bones of Jesus were actually discovered, then the resurrection would be false and you should not believe in it.
Really? Why? That's kind of weak.
But I think that given the uncertainty inherent in archaeological discoveries, we're never going to have evidence
exactly
that the actual bones of Jesus were found. I think the possibility would always be there to say this is probably not actually his tomb. Fortunately, I don't think we find ourselves in that situation, Alex, because I think that the evidence for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, including the empty tomb, is very strong. And so I don't feel that sort of tension between faith and fact. To me, faith and fact are aligned. But I do realize that for certain people at certain times and places in history, the evidence and the truth can be out of sync with each other. And again, I
Shit.
refer back to
Stop
my
doing this.
illustration of students in the old Soviet Union who had to persist in faith in spite of the evidence that they had from their professors and teachers. And I think that they were rational to do so.
Well, let's see if you might be able to help out a non-resistant non-believer like myself. You say that we're kind of in the opposite situation to the one that I hypothetically described, and that our historical evidence seems to point towards the resurrection of Jesus.
Fuck.
And I'm wondering if we can dive into that a little bit. One question is, do you think it's fair to say that we can't prove historically the resurrection of Jesus? That's not the kind of thing that's open to historical proof. Rather, we can only prove historical facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus and then ask what the best explanation for those facts is.
Well, I guess I don't see an inherent contradiction between those two things, because I think proving that a certain historical hypothesis is the best explanation and is more probable than not is a form of proof. So it all depends on how much weight you pack into that word prove. If you mean a mathematical demonstration, then of course you cannot, but that's simply inherent in the nature of historical inquiry. But if you mean prove in the sense of provide good historical evidence for a conclusion to make it more probable than not, in that sense, I think it can be proven.
Stop.
So here's a question, because this comes up a lot. People will often say that when we look at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, we don't have very much.
What?
We have the Gospels, we have the letters of Paul, we have passing reference to Jesus' existence in some extra-biblical texts. This isn't very much. And then a response often comes, okay, maybe this isn't a whole lot, but by the historical standards that we usually apply to look at cases of what may have happened in history, we have this wealth of evidence. You know, if you compare the attestations to Jesus' ministry to any other historical figure of the time, it dwarfs
Yes.
it. Do you think that because of the radical nature of the claim being made here, not just involving the miracles of Jesus' ministry and the resurrection, but also the moral importance of this story and the fact that it's supposed to be essentially the central event of human history, that although we may have a higher standard of historical evidence compared to other average historical facts, we should expect a much higher standard of evidence, perhaps even higher than what we have available to us
Alright, fuckers.
as it stands?
Yeah, I don't agree with that attitude at all, Alex. And I got myself into some controversy by saying this. Recently, it seems to me that in virtue of what's at stake in believing in the existence of God and Christ, that it would be wrong to demand higher standards of evidence for this. If anything, it would seem to me that one would be more ready to believe if there's any sort of shred of evidence that would be supportive of it because of the tremendous practical benefits from its being true. And this is the idea of the Pascalian wagering, again, that I mentioned earlier. In addition to being epistemically justified in holding a belief, a person could be practically justified in holding a belief. And I think that belief in Christianity can be pragmatically justified in virtue of the great benefits that are to be had if it turns out to be true. Now, having said that, though, I do think that it is also epistemically justified, and I
have
would
no fucking time to play Tartars, you know, Runa. Fuck that level anyway. I don't know.
didn't want to be misunderstood there. I just said a moment ago that I think it can be proved, by which I mean that you can show that the best explanation of the established facts concerning the fate of Jesus of Nazareth is the explanation the original disciples gave, that God raised him from the dead. But I wouldn't apply to that epistemic justification a different standard than you would apply to other events in history.
Even despite the fact that this is a far more significant historical event and one which we're expected to believe is authored by a supernatural creator who has a very strong interest in us coming to believe that it occurred. I think this is that even from a secular perspective, there's that old maxim of Carl Sagan's that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I wonder what you think of that, but that would be true even if it weren't for the fact that the extraordinary claim being made here is one that we're supposed to believe that the omnipotent creator of the universe also wants us desperately to believe, and yet the evidence provided is maybe just about in line, maybe a little bit more of what we'd expect from any average historical analysis into the past. Shouldn't we expect a bit more if God wants us to believe this so badly?
This commonsensical slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, I think, is demonstrably false.
Really?
It misunderstands the probability calculus. Events which are extraordinary and therefore highly improbable relative to the background evidence can nevertheless turn out to be highly probable if the evidence on the hypothesis is much more probable than the evidence would be if the hypothesis were false. And so it's just, I think, demonstrably wrong to mouth this slogan that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence. You can have ordinary evidence that will be sufficient to establish an extraordinary event. What's key will be the ratio between the probability of the evidence on the hypothesis and the probability of the evidence on the negation of the hypothesis. Now, again, in terms of what's at stake, there you get into these pragmatic considerations. I mean, epistemically,
Can you fucking double click clearly?
you shouldn't raise or lower your epistemic standards based on what's at stake.
Fuck me.
But if you do think that the pragmatic can encroach on the epistemic, that there can be pragmatic encroachment on the epistemic to either raise or lower the bar for belief, then I think it can go either way. And in the case of Christianity, I would say it would lower the bar because of what's at stake. You don't want to miss out by making the bar too high. And that would be the danger you would run. Let me give you an illustration of pragmatic justification that involves lowering the bar. Suppose you're diagnosed with stage 4 stomach cancer, and you're told that you have only a few more months to live and that it looks pretty hopeless. On the other hand, there is this treatment that you can take that a few people have managed to survive the cancer by doing this treatment. And so you decide to take it. Now, if you go simply by what the epistemic evidence would justify, you would believe that you are not going to survive. You are probably not going to make it. But suppose you also know that people who believe that they will make it are shown to have a better chance of survival than those who are realistic. In that case, you would be pragmatically justified in believing that you're going to make it because that will increase the chances of...
Is believing in God pragmatically justified, though? I wonder.
You actually will make it. So that would be a case where if you allow the pragmatic to encroach on the epistemic, it would serve to lower the bar to make you pragmatically justified in believing something that you're not epistemically justified in believing. But again, Alex, I want to emphasize, I think that Christianity is epistemically justified, and that the facts that establish the resurrection of Jesus, or that undergird it, I should say, are recognized by the wide majority of New Testament historians, And that when you compare the resurrection hypothesis to the alternative hypothesis, it exceeds those hypotheses in terms of meeting the standards for being the best explanation by head and shoulders. So this is all in one sense sort of academic. It's not the situation in which we actually find ourselves.
What?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I want to say about this epistemic bar, but I'm also interested in shelving that to actually talk about some of this evidence.
What?
You say that, look, this explanation of the historical facts around Jesus' death are best explained by a resurrection when you compare them to the alternatives. Surely it's quite a difficult thing to do to judge the prior probabilities involved here. For example, one explanation that's sometimes given of the facts around Jesus' death is that the disciples all made it up. The disciples were just flatly lying.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes.
this might be a bit of a strange suggestion. Why would people be put to death as the disciples were, to die for something they knew to be true? There are various reasons why it might be a bad explanation.
Because they're religious cucks. Deluded religious cucks.
That they were all lying. But when compared, for an atheist at least, against an explanation that says that there was some divine intervention that led to a man actually rising again from the dead, even though alternative explanations do, I grant you, seem incredibly implausible, whatever happened on Easter morning, it was weird. I don't know what happened that morning, but whatever happened, it was very, very strange. But it doesn't seem obvious to me that even though these different explanations aren't particularly compelling, that should increase my credence in the belief that a man rose from the dead, which seems infinitely less plausible before, all other things being equal.
Yeah, I don't think that there is anything implausible about miracles if God exists. And so in presenting a case for Christianity,
Why is there
I
only
don't
one?
lead with the evidence for the resurrection. I lead with those other arguments that give you a theistic context.
It's like believing in Slender Man. But you have pictures of Slender Man. Even if photoshopped, you don't have pictures of Jesus walking alive after being crucified.
And if there is a God who created and designed the universe and brought it into existence, then the idea that he might raise someone from the dead is not so implausible.
Why only
Peter
one
Slezak,
person?
an Australian philosopher, in our debate on the resurrection, remarked that for a creator of the universe, the odd resurrection is child's play. And I thought, well, that's really true. So for the atheist who stumbles at the miraculous nature of this explanation, I think he needs to go back to those theistic arguments and review those before coming to the evidence for Jesus' resurrection.
Now, I think my listeners will be broadly familiar, so perhaps without going into too much depth, just bullet pointing, what are the main points of evidence that you would direct people's attention to say these are reasons to think that a man rose from the dead on Easter morning?
First, I would say, what are the facts to be explained? And those would include things like the death of Jesus of Nazareth by Roman crucifixion during...
Because he was fucking going around and indoctrinating people, making them believe that if you die you go to heaven. So go and die, you all. And so he and his cult would overthrow the government. The beggars would overthrow the government. So
Passover around AD 30. Second, his burial or interment in a tomb by a member of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Sanhedrin, named Joseph of Arimathea. Thirdly, the discovery by a group of his female followers on the Sunday morning after the crucifixion that tomb was empty. Fourth would be that thereafter various individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. And then the last one would be that the earliest disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised Jesus from the dead despite having every predisposition to the contrary. And then I would ask the question, if those are the facts of the case, and the wide majority of scholars agree with all five of those points, then the question is, how do you best explain them? And I can't think of a better explanation than the one that the original disciples gave. When you assess these explanations in terms of the standard criteria for being a good historical explanation, things like explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, consistency with other beliefs,
Unfortunately, I'm done with this level,
and so
Jill.
on and so forth.
Oh my god, I
Why
wanna
could
kill
the
myself
disciples
so
not have
badly.
been making it up?
Well, just take one of the facts that they suddenly and sincerely came to believe that God had raised him from the dead, despite every predisposition to the contrary. You would have to say that that is in fact not a fact. So you would go back to whether or not that is true, and I think that the evidence is that these earliest followers of Jesus did sincerely believe the truth of the message that they proclaimed and were willing to die for. People don't die for a lie that they have themselves made up, and so I think that it's very, very plausible that these earliest disciples sincerely believed this. Moreover, if they were making it up, they would never have invented something like the resurrection of Jesus, because, as I said, it is completely contrary to every predisposition they had in first century Judaism. In Judaism, the resurrection was never of an isolated person.
No!
In history. It was always a general resurrection of all the righteous dead after the end of the world.
So bad.
So the original disciples confronted with Jesus' crucifixion and death would not have come to make up a lie about his rising from the dead. They would have at best looked forward to their reunion with him on the day of judgment, when all of the righteous dead would be raised and ushered into the kingdom of God. I think that those who hold to a conspiracy theory are looking at history through a rear view mirror. They don't put themselves in the footsteps of these first century Jews and ask, what would they say after their Messiah was crucified? They would not say, oh, well, God raised him from the dead and he was Messiah after all, because that was completely contrary to Jewish belief. So, as N.T. Wright, the prominent New Testament scholar, has rightly put it, if your favorite Messiah got himself crucified, you basically had two choices. You either go home or you get yourself a new Messiah. But it would have been completely un-Jewish to say that God raised him from the dead and he was the Messiah after all. So I think the conspiracy theory contradicts both the sincerity of the first disciples.
Where? Test mode from where? Oh my god.
As well as for the anachronistic nature of the hypothesis that they made up this belief.
What evidence do we have about disciples being put to death for their beliefs? I know that in the Gospels themselves, or in the Bible, I believe only two disciples' deaths are recorded, one of which being the suicide of Judas, and the other being, rightly, as you say, due to somebody being a Christian. But I wonder, is there a conversation to be had, for instance, about whether, do we know that had they recanted their belief, they would have been saved, for example? Because it may have gotten to a point where nothing they could have said would have saved them, and so even if they were making it up, it may have been too late and they go to death anyway.
Right. I don't think there's any way to know, but what we do know, I think, from the evidence of the New Testament is that these earliest Christian believers were willing to suffer incredibly in attestation to the truth of what they proclaimed.
No, this is
and some of them, at least, did die, and others were willing to die. And so I think that the sincerity of these earliest Christians is pretty indisputable.
Okay, so people don't die for things they know to be false, but people do die for things that they mistakenly think are true but are in fact false.
Right.
So
Yes.
here's theory number 2. What if the disciples were simply mistaken in their belief that Jesus had risen from the dead? Perhaps a grief-induced hallucination or something of the sort.
Yes. That's a better theory, I think. And unlike the conspiracy theory, the hallucination theory is one that still finds defenders today, where
That might be both.
the conspiracy theory has been obsolete for well over 100 years. I think there are a number of problems with the hallucination theory. One that I've already alluded to. Jews did not believe in a resurrection of an isolated person within history. So if they were to project hallucinations of Jesus after his death, they would have projected hallucinations of Jesus glorified in heaven, in Abraham's bosom. This is where the righteous dead went to wait until the resurrection at the end of the world. But in that case, it wouldn't have led to belief in Jesus' resurrection, but rather belief in Jesus' assumption or translation into heaven. And in Jewish thinking, these are two very different categories. The assumption of a person is the snatching of that person out of the space-time world into heavenly realms, whereas a resurrection is the raising up of that dead person in the grave in the space-time universe to new life. And they proclaim not the assumption of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus. And therefore, I don't think hallucinations are have the adequate explanatory power to account for the belief in the resurrection. Moreover, the hallucination hypothesis doesn't say anything to explain the historicity of the empty tomb. The fact of Jesus' empty tomb was a publicly inspectable fact in Jerusalem, which anyone could verify, including the enemies of the disciples. And therefore, in order
So why nobody cared?
You've got to conjoin to the hallucination hypothesis some independent hypothesis to explain all the evidence. And thus the hallucination hypothesis is not only defective in explanatory power, it's defective in explanatory scope.
Man rise from the fucking dead, nobody's Christian, what the fuck?
In conjunction with it to explain the full scope of the evidence. So those are just a couple of problems with the hallucination hypothesis.
Yeah, I mean, for example, you'd have to, because people might want to say, well, maybe the disciples just hid the body, but then you're not talking about hallucinations anymore. Now you're talking about deceit.
Right, you're back to the conspiracy theory again, that they stole the body and then they lied about the resurrection appearances for some mysterious reason. And as I say, I think that hypothesis is just so implausible in light of the evident sincerity of these men and women, as well as the fact that it's terribly anachronistic, because that's not the sort of lie that a first century Jew would make up when his favorite Messiah got crucified.
Now, we've kind of spoken so far as if the reports that we have in the Gospels, and I suppose the letters of Paul, things like this as well, are accurate. We're saying, well, look, you know, the disciples wouldn't have made this up, or they couldn't have been hallucinating because people could have checked, as if the timeline and the events that we believe happened we're justified in believing. What if the very reports of the disciples' death and their beliefs and what not just what actually happened, but the reports of what these people claimed happened are mistaken. For example,
Yes.
the only reason that we can believe in group appearances is because of a passing reference that Paul made to the 500 that's not recognized anywhere else. Group appearances appear in some of the Gospels, not others. Indeed, there are no post-resurrection appearances at all in the earliest Gospel, which is thought to be the source for Matthew and Luke as well. It seems a little bit kind of spotty, and people might ask, okay, sure, if these group appearances happened, you'd be hard-pressed to explain them as a hallucination. But what if the reports are just wrong?
Okay, now this goes back to that first step, establishing the data to be explained. It seems to me that once you reach the second step, that is to say, what is the best explanation of the facts, then these naturalistic explanations all turn out to be pretty hopeless. They really, really are implausible and don't do the trick. And that's why
Cannot spam what?
scholars who don't accept the resurrection hypothesis, generally speaking, don't adopt any of those naturalistic alternatives. Instead, they just embrace agnosticism. They just say what you said, something remarkable happened on Easter morning, but we don't know what it is. So
I literally can't.
I do think that that second step is the easier step. What I didn't appreciate when I did my study of the historicity of the resurrection in Germany under Voltaire Pannenberg is the degree to which the first step, that is to say, establishing the data to be explained, represents the wide majority view of contemporary New Testament scholars. That is to say, things like Jesus' crucifixion, honorable burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the transformation of the first disciples. These represent the wide view, widely held view of the majority of scholars, whether liberal or conservative, Christian or non-Christian. These facts are pretty convincingly established. So take, for example, the post-mortem appearances of Jesus. These are attested, as you say, in this extremely early tradition that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 and then hands on to his converts in Corinth. This tradition goes back to within the first 5 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, and therefore is not plausibly explained away as a late legendary development. Rather, people were still alive, were still around, who had seen these post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Moreover, these appearances are multiply and independently attested, as you say, in the Gospels, such as the appearance to disciples.
64? Wait, this level is not so long.
And therefore, we have really good historical grounds for believing that these disciples experienced these post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Even in Mark, where, as you say, a resurrection appearance is not narrated, nevertheless, Mark clearly knows of resurrection appearances of Jesus because he foreshadows them when Jesus says, "Go into Galilee, there you will see me." And so the disciples in the other Gospels then go to Galilee and do experience these appearances. So even Mark knows of them, but simply foreshadows them and doesn't narrate them. And so, Alex, I'm not kidding.
This level is fucking impossible without alt tabbing. Oh my god.
Denies that the original disciples had these post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Even the skeptical critic John Dominic Crossan, when I debated him on the resurrection of Jesus, I thought perhaps he denied the appearances, but he was indignant when I suggested. He says, "Of course I believe that they had these experiences." So again, you're back to whether or not these can be plausibly explained on the basis of psychological phenomena like hallucinations, but it's pretty difficult to deny that they occurred.
Well, I mean, we have, it seems a little suspicious to me, shall we say, that in Mark's Gospel we end with no account of the post-resurrection appearance, but essentially a prediction. Go to Galilee and Jesus will meet you there, and that's it. And then we have the Gospel of Matthew, the next earliest, which reports, a meeting of Jesus with the 12 at Galilee, as predicted by Mark. If being used as a source, potentially something, if this didn't really happen, that the author of Matthew could have said, well, look, this is something Mark said was going to happen, so maybe we should include it. And crucially, in that report that Matthew gives of the appearance to the 12 at Galilee, not all of the disciples even believe. Some of them doubt, and so it can't be this obvious, wow, look at this appearance of Jesus, undeniable proof that he's risen from the dead. I mean, some of the disciples who've been with him for his entire ministry were present at this appearance and doubted that it was him. They didn't, it wasn't even universally obvious to the people there that it was Jesus. And then Luke's Gospel, the next earliest, we have the addition of more appearances. We have the road to Emmaus, the appearance to the two disciples walking along the road to Emmaus. We also get the addition of the Ascension. And then John's Gospel, the latest Gospel, the latest Gospel written, according to most biblical scholarship, more fanciful still. Now we have appearances of Jesus that require him to move into rooms with locked doors, and then you have the story of doubting Thomas coming up and touching the wound. In other words, the further away we get on the timeline from the actual event itself, the more fanciful and the more frequent these appearances seem to be recounted. Is this not... Can you understand the suspicion upon someone reading the Gospels in their historical order might have in thinking that we have this development of what they may suspect is a myth over time?
Yeah, I can understand it, but I think that is based upon a failure to appreciate the effort of New Testament historians to get at the traditional sources behind the gospel stories, so that it's not simply the date of when the gospels were written. What's important here is the date of the tradition that they embody. And so, for example, in Matthew and Luke, you have traditions of the appearances that are independent of Mark. They didn't come from Mark, but neither are they simply invented out of whole cloth by Matthew and Luke, because they have these telltale signs of tradition that has been handed on and received by these authors. And similarly with the traditions in John. So I think what you've got is multiple independent traditions of these post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And it won't do to just write these off as legendary or mythical, because they go right back to the earliest sources, such as Paul's tradition that he hands on in 1 Corinthians 15, which goes back to within 5 years after Jesus' death, the pre-Markan Passion story of Jesus, which foreshadows his appearance in Galilee, and is an extremely early source. And then you've got these sources behind Matthew and Luke and John that also speak of these post-mortem appearances of Jesus. So it would be unreasonable to just say that these are all late developing legends that did not characterize the experience of the earliest disciples. And as I say, this isn't just sort of my opinion. This is the virtually unanimous opinion of historical Jesus scholarship.
I find it fascinating. It's strange, you know. I like to keep these podcasts conversational, and so I don't prepare strictly, but I had an idea of things that I might want to say in response to you. And as with our episode on the Quran, you surprise me sometimes with how powerfully you can respond to these points. Talking of disciples lying or hallucinating, I often hear talk about points that I know you've given yourself in the past about why would they invent women discovering the tombs, or you don't get group hallucinations occurring. And I have things to say on these
How
points,
long
but to
is
hear
it?
about it, just in principle, why would these disciples hallucinate something that's totally out of accordance with their religious tradition? And indeed, why would they make that up if they weren't hallucinating
Because
it?
Jesus told them that that's what's going to happen, you know?
I think it's fascinating, and so I hope people listening have. I mean, I feel like I haven't challenged you as much as I expected to, but I've just been so interested in letting you explain these in their depth, because I think they're wonderful responses.
And I appreciate that so much, Alex. This was all new information to me when I did my doctoral work in Munich under Kallenbach.
What?
When I went there,
What?
I basically
What?
thought that the apologetic for the resurrection of Jesus was a sort of Josh McDowell apologetic based on who moved the stone, you know, that kind of thing. Was it conspiracy? Was it hallucination? Was it wrong tomb theory? It was all those naturalistic alternatives to the resurrection. But what I did not know about, and what I discovered, was this wealth of historical data pertinent to those 5 facts that I mentioned.
What?
Call for some sort of explanation. And that is fascinating. If you haven't done so, I'd
The
encourage you
freest
to
fucking
read
part.
my account of these in my book, Reasonable Faith, where I lay out multiple lines of evidence in favor of each one of those 5 facts that has proved convincing to most New Testament scholars today.
Yes, well, I did want to end by asking you if you had recommended reading or listening or watching, I suppose, for my viewers. Reasonable Faith will be linked, as I probably would have linked it anyway in the description. I wonder if you have advice not just for reading Christian sources on the historicity of the resurrection, but also if you know of the best skeptical resources from people that you disagree with that you might recommend.
Yes, I do. I think the
What?
most powerful negative case that I've ever read concerning the resurrection of Jesus by an esteemed New Testament scholar who's very objective and credible is an essay by Dale Allison on the resurrection of Jesus. I can't remember the exact title.
Get real.
It might be in his book on Jesus' resurrection, but you can find it by looking at Dale Allison.
What am I actually doing?
And it is all the more remarkable that for all his skepticism, which I think is excessive, he still comes in the end to affirming the historicity of the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, the transformation in the lives of the earliest disciples, those factors that I mentioned. But you will not find anywhere a more critical and objective sifting of the evidence than in Dale Allison's work on the resurrection.
Well, I will make sure that is linked also in the description down below. Dr. Craig, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alex. Been a pleasure.
Did you enjoy that conversation? You must have done at least a little bit, because you appear to have made it to the end. And if you made it to the end of that one, you can perhaps make it to the beginning of the next. So please click here to watch the most recent full episode of the Within Reason podcast, or click just below to watch a selection of clips from that podcast. Also remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel and the Clips channel, and if you haven't found us on Spotify and iTunes, then please do that too, where you'll find audio versions of all the podcasts that I release. With that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
What? What are those legs? Who the fuck asked for order? Who the fuck needs order next video on YouTube?
I think to be...
I fucking leg spiked. Incredible, go fuck yourself. Go fuck yourself. No. Who the fuck asked for notebook? No! I was so good. Again, I was so good. What? Come on. Incredible. Incredible. Fuck! Come on. I need to take a fucking breath. Apparently. Finally, normal camera. What? No! This is the second time today. I'm so disappointed I want to kill myself. No, I want to do it even more. Come on. What? Come on. What? Miserable. This pattern was free, it was not worth continuing. It was not worth passing the level with such a free pattern. Fuck. I could have survived, actually, honestly. What? Fuck you. Stop dying like an Omega player. Oh! I'm gonna kill myself. Give me a good pattern. Come on. Fuck you. Fuck you. I'm so tired of this. Why are we here just to suffer? This is so disgusting. Fuck this level. Oh. No! This is a mistake a newbie makes. Fucking player that plays this game for an hour of total playtime. No! Fucking hell. Fuck! Never passable, yes. Sure, never passable. Oh! What? This is despicable. What? What? No. Come on. I'm going to like, I don't know. I'm not going to do anything. So fun when you're not precise enough for one space gaps and third speed. So fun. Oh my god. So fun.
No! This is so bad. I should have just survived. What the actual fuck? What? This is just... What? No, I'm actually not meant for GD. Why am I always doing that on every level that I play? Oh, fuck. Oh,
This bikini. It was made to fucking torture people. For treason.
Ah! What? Come on!
Just use your fucking muscle memory if you have any. Oh, you don't.
What?
I'm getting too loud. Gonna... Fuck this.
What?
What are you doing? Now this
Song is too fucking loud. I'm not used to it.
I'm going to quit GD.
No!
Fuck.
Oh, this is not even close. No! No!
is actually free. You just have to not die to the beginning. And then click precisely here. And then you just fluke the level.
Does it actually sound hard?
I don't think so.
Fuck. What? Why? What?
Like. If I released later, I would have survived. I mean the previous release. I'm going to kill myself. Stop. I'm going to hurt someone. If that won't stop. Oh no, guy.
No! Wait! What? For the second time you click like 10 or 15 milliseconds before hitting the fucking portal. What have I done? No! Oh, shit! You cannot be making a mistake like that. Did I? No. 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 What? No. I don't even have. I don't have any more energy to fucking scream. I can only click my tongue in disappointment. You're for the third time. Oh, stop. Fuck! No, I one more time. I thought it was dead. No, for why? I just cannot do this fucking pattern because the wave is not normal gravity. Oh.
just luck based, you know? Third speed, 1 space gaps are luck based. For the likes of me.
I cry, but not because I died, but because of this.
Who the fuck waves like that?
What? What?
Come on. It was not even close.
I wanna die!
Not like that. In real life.
No! Stop!
I guess I'm fucking cooked if I die like that.
Stop doing that! Stop repeating that! Fourth fucking time. Ah! What? Stop. What?
You cannot be real. What's the fucking playtime? 50. What? You. This. It's lying. It's actually like 54 hours. Oh yeah, this is an incredible death. Unfortunately, what is this? Let me fucking... Oh, it's so short. Oh. Wait, twice in a row. Twice in a row. Oh. Alright, it counts. Huh. Twice in a row. No! Anyways. No! How far was that? Let me continue maybe. I never wanted no clip. Yeah. Incredible. Fuck this level. Wave challenge hard? What is this? Oh. No, it's too hard apparently. Oh, is this like wave almighty? What was this? Oh, this is hard. Let's practice the level. This shit is impossible, wait, what? I love 2.2, no, I actually hate it so much.
Why can't you restart the attempt from pause on 2.2? Why does this version suck dick so hard?
Whatever, I can do that from 0. If I rest enough. We've spent this level. It's for kids. I need something semi-space too. Anything like interesting tiny 5 seconds. Yeah, that's good enough. What is it? Oh, this one. What an epic transition. Is that really one space gap? It looks fucking tighter. Let's practice it for a bit. Maybe like... yeah. Ah. Why am I doing this? Oh, this shit's hard. Oh. Get real. Oh no, I will be dying to this gap forever. This is for grown-up adults. What was this? No, this one is hard. Definitely. I need something simple, you know. Where's that level? I guess it's... Is it? No. This one. I can do this. No, you can't really do this. Alright, I'll just use my right hand. No, no, what? I love to point so fucking much. I hate to print so much! You cannot practice level in this version. You just cannot do that because you cannot restart from pause. Why am I fucking dying to that? Fuck this game. Oh my god. Goodbye, guys.